A few days after the departure of the emperor, I was told that a list of prescriptions, which was said to contain the names of 2,000 persons, was making up under the inspection of Messieurs de Talleyrand and Fouché by order of the princess, and that Madame the Duchesse of Angoulême vouchsafed to take an active part in the measure. Many persons had already fled from France. The intrepid de Baudot, who, a few days after the return of the king, had openly protested against his reign at the Chamber of Peers, took some pains to make me comprehend the danger I stood in. The Duc de Bassano-Marais, at his departure, wished to persuade me to follow him quickly, but I, prepossessed by the idea that my conduct was above all reproach, rejected the cautions of friendship. The Princess de Vaudemont entreated me to at least seek some retreat for a short time. She told me that it was Fouché's wish that I should, but he never thought of offering me the passport I might stand in need of. The situation of my wife, who was far advanced in pregnancy and very unwell, made the idea of my flight impossible for me to bear. But within the walls of a prison, said I to myself, I may still protect her. Prejudice will diminish, and the royal resentment will undoubtedly vent itself on those who are absent. The more I examined my conduct, the more I was convinced that my cause could only be brought before the correctional police, and the result would be no more than an imprisonment for 2 or 5 years for having taken upon me the superintendence of the post office a few hours before the emperor arrived. Having made up my mind to do this, I was the more obstinate in my refusal to fly, and I proposed to the Princess de Vaudemont to give her a letter addressed to Monsieur Talleyrand, in which I should explain my conduct. She consented to lay it before him. In that letter, I unfolded to the ministry my whole conduct since the Restoration, all the steps I had taken on the 20th of March, and I concluded by soliciting my trial. My wishes in that respect were soon complied with. On the 18th of July, I was sitting at dinner with Madame Lavalette and Monsieur de Menival, when an inspector of the police came to tell me that the prefect, Monsieur de Cazes, wished to speak to me. When I stepped into the hackney coach, I saw that I was surrounded by 3 or 4 spies who were good enough to act the part of footmen, and stepped up behind the carriage. In less than half an hour, I was in the registering room of the prison of the prefecture. I was introduced to the jailer, who paid little attention to me, being busy with distributing lodges to several newcomers, among whom I discovered Monsieur de P., who had long been secretary of the Duc de Vigo, Savary, and appeared to be the person in whom he placed the greatest confidence. He seemed so grieved and mortified to be where he was that I went up to him and had already begun to express my pity for his misfortune, when all of a sudden he turned aside and, pointing to me, said to the turnkey, "Conduct this gentleman to number 17th, after which he disappeared. This man, thought I, had very cleverly turned his coat, and I followed my guide, blushing at the mistake I had made. He introduced me into a dirty garret with a window that opened in the roof at 12 feet from the floor. I was permitted, if I could, to open it by means of an iron bar with notches, but so heavy that it was not possible for me to raise it. When one enters into prison, anger always follows the first surprise. I began by throwing out some energetic exclamations against the prefect, who had not deigned to receive me in his apartments, though he had sent for me to come and speak to him. I was not yet acquainted with the code of politeness of the prefect of police, but I soon made great improvement in that branch of knowledge. As there was no bell, I was obliged to wait 3 hours before I received a visit from the turnkey, who brought me for dinner some disgusting prison ragout. I made some inquiries respecting the prisoners who lodged on the floor above me. I had seen through a keyhole men carrying bottles and all the prescriptions for a feast. They seem to be very merry, I added. They are 2 aides-de-camp of General Labedoyer. How Is he then arrested? I believe so. The next day, these two officers were set at liberty, and I afterwards learned the following particulars. The unfortunate Le Baudoyer, after the army of the Loire had been disbanded, had retired to the outskirts of Riom with several of his friends, among whom was General Flahaut, his near relation. The latter, who possesses a cool head and unites prudence to much courage, immediately perceived the danger of their position. He was convinced that nothing remained for them to do but to pass the frontiers as quickly as they could. Le Baudoyer was of the same opinion, but no persuasion could make him alter his plan. He wanted to go to the United States, but on his way to pass through Paris, where he wished to take leave of his family and raise some money. All the exertions of friendship had no power over him. He stepped into the diligence under a false name and found among his traveling companions two wretches in regimentals who pretended they came from the army of the Loire and were scarcely arrived in Paris when they informed against him. These were the two prisoners who were merrily feasting on a part of the money they had received as the reward of their treachery. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the jailer came to call me down to the chief clerk, who was to examine me. In my situation, this might be looked upon as some amusement. I was therefore far from wishing to decline it, and I was conducted through a labyrinth of passages to a room on the ground floor where I found Monsieur V, who was dismissed a little while after. This inquisitor, who was a short, fat man, was seated in his armchair where, for the space of 29 years, he had been asking questions at all hours of the day and night, under all possible governments. After having taken down in writing 3 or 4 pages of questions and answers, he stopped. And as we had neither of us much inclination for sleep, he eagerly took advantage of some inquiries I made about his occupations to relate to me all the prowess of the prefects of police, the manner the prisoners made their defense, and the confessions he extorted from them, his skill in troubling their conscience, in disconcerting their firmness, in surprising their tenets, in pursuing their confessions, and finally in sounding the bottom of their hearts. I cannot help recording here one of these anecdotes, which I thought remarkable in the words he gave it to me. Among the conspirators of the infernal machine was one Monsieur N, an intimate friend of Le Moulin, the first inventor of the plot. He had served among the Chouans, and the police supposed reasonably enough that he was in Paris. After being hunted like a fox for several days, he slept at night in the charcoal boats in the Pont-au Bled. When the pursuit had ceased in that part of the town, he ventured to seek a retreat in a miserable garret in a public house. The next day, the police came back, but he had escaped and was seen no more. His room was searched, and near the bed was found a scrap of half-burned paper, which he had used to light his pipe. This paper contained, however, some written lines, which seemed to be part of the rough draft of a letter addressed to some general, who was supposed to be George. On the last line were the following words: "I cannot write any more today, as I have a great pain in my eyes." This unfortunate man was afterwards implicated and taken in the conspiracy of George, and I had the pleasure of examining him. He was sitting where you are, his face between 2 wax candles, as yours is. While I was talking with him, I continued writing. He was my countryman. I spoke to him of his parents, of his first affections, of his schoolfellows, and having observed that he began to gain assurance and that his answers betrayed a little more cheerfulness, I stopped all of a sudden and said in the most natural tone I could, "But the light annoys you. You may put out the candles if you choose." "No, I have no pain in my eyes." "I thought you had." "No, not at present. My eyes were bad, it is true, about 2 years ago." We continued our conversation. At last, I slowly read to him his conversation. He was surprised to find I had inserted in it so trivial a circumstance, and asked why I had done it. "It is my custom." Now, will you believe that this very trivial circumstance convicted him? The half-burned scrap of paper had been preserved. The writing was compared with his, and his presence in Paris at the time of the infernal machine was proved. And what became of him, said I. He was guillotined, answered V, with a most fiendish look and gesture. He said to me, I am fond of my profession. I cannot remain one day out of this apartment. I might go to the play and divert myself with friends, my wife, my children, but no, I must be here. While listening to him, I observed that by custom he constantly leered to the left side, where the prisoners were placed. And I am convinced that if they had been put at his right, he would have lost half his skill. When he read my examination to me, and before I signed it, I asked why he had not inserted his anecdote in it. Oh, your business cannot go far, he said. You are not an important man for me. I remained a fortnight in that temporary prison without seeing Monsieur Decazes, who might have been a little troubled at having me so near him, if he had not entirely forgotten our former connection. The bad air and the vexations of a prison gave me an inflammatory complaint. My physician, who was also the medical attendant of Monsieur Decazes, prescribed for me with great care, which contributed to make them change my prison and send me speedily on my trial for fear I should escape by a natural death from the one they were preparing for me. On Sunday, the 24th of July, I was abruptly put into a hackney coach to be conveyed to the conciergerie at a small distance from where I was. There are many people in Paris wholly unacquainted with the existence of the dungeon of the conciergerie, which are beneath the magnificent apartments of the Palais de Justice, and which it is reported served in the time of St. Louis as kitchens and pantries for the royal household. I was introduced into the registering room, where I found the jailer, whose name was, I think, Lendrahine. He was a tall man, disagreeably familiar. Though with tolerably polite manners, he began to make aloud the description of my person and invited me afterwards to follow him to the end of a dark passage where my new abode was situated. This was a long and narrow space terminated by a window covered with a slanting roof that just enabled me to distinguish a square foot of the sky. Bare walls covered with names and exclamations of despair traced with charcoal were the only ornaments of this dungeon. A wretched bed, an old table, one chair, and 2 tubs of foul water were all its furniture. I describe it thus minutely because it was there that Marshal passed the 3 first weeks that he remained in prison. I was weaker than he, for he did not complain of it. But when I saw that it would be impossible for me to read during half an hour, I burst into reproaches and wrote to the prefect of police that disease would soon kill me if my lodging were not changed. In the evening, the jailer came to lead me to the promenade of a large yard called the Green. And at 9 o'clock, instead of bringing me up again to my dungeon, he introduced me into a room on the ground floor where I found a fireplace and a window looking into a small yard separated from the women's yard by a high wall. I could not place you here this morning, he said, because General Lebedoyer was locked up in the next room, but he has been transferred to the Abbaye. The next day I wished to see his chamber. It was still more inconvenient and more dismal than the one I had left. He had remained there 8 days in the most rigorous solitary confinement, abandoned in a manner by the keepers who only visited him twice in 24 hours. The dungeon was so narrow that he could not even walk about in it, though that was the only diversion left him, as he was deprived of books, newspapers, and of all manner of correspondence. They began, according to custom, to keep me during 6 weeks without any communication. I could receive no letters unless they were opened, nor see a friend, except in the presence of the registrar. The accounts I received from my wife were painful. Her tremulous handwriting, the sufferings she sought in vain to dissemble by repeated assurances of good health, her 5 months' pregnancy, of which he never spoke, all added to my anxiety. I soon felt also the inconveniences of my prison. Next to my room was an enormous iron door that was opened at every hour of the day and the night to relieve the sentry. Its violent motion shook my bed and interrupted my sleep, while the cold and damp of the air obliged me to have fire night and day. Such torments, every instant renewed, were, however, far from discouraging me, and I had no need to seek moral force in meditation or in delusions that vanished every day more and more before the sad truth. I found it in my attachment for the emperor. I suffered, but it was for him. My misfortune was heightened by the consideration of the cause that had given it birth. My name and fate were united to his immortal name, and besides, were not his sufferings worse than mine? The perfidy of the English government was leading him to St. Helena. How many torments were preparing for him in his banishment. At the world's end, I should have blushed to complain in presence of such a disaster. The vengeance of kings fell heavy on us both, and I found at once honor and glory in sharing it, and saved me from all weakness. The idea that he would read my trial, and that my death would cause him some emotion, that I showed myself worthy of his attachment and his trust, elevated me in my own eyes. I shall explain hereafter how that feeling of energy against misfortune received a powerful support from another cause. A few weeks after my imprisonment, I was one day walking in the yard. I saw Marshal Ney at the bottom of the staircase, which led to my former dungeon. He bowed to me as he went quickly up, accompanied by the jailer and an officer of the gendarmes. It was thus I learned that he was arrested. Like me, he had scorned to leave the kingdom and had only sought refuge in the country seat of one of his wife's relations near Cahors. His saber, which he had left in the drawing room, betrayed him for the first time. He suffered himself to be taken, convinced that they would not dare to condemn him. After he had remained a month in that dungeon, he was at last placed above me in the registrar's lodging. There was a stove that defended him from the cold, and his grated window, being higher than mine, procured him a less unwholesome air than what I breathed. But his name and his rank could not protect him from the hardships they seemed to take pleasure in inflicting on him. He played tolerably well on the flute, and during several days he amused himself with his instrument. He was, however, deprived of this resource under the pretense that it was against the rules of the prison. He repeatedly played a waltz, which I long recollected and frequently hummed in my evening musings. I had never heard it anywhere else, till once again it struck my ear in Bavaria. It was at a bal champêtre on the borders of Lake Starnberg. I had before my eyes young peasant girls merrily skipping on the fresh green sward. The air was sweet, melancholy, and when played on the flute, it immediately recalled to my memory the conciergerie, and I retired unable to repress my tears, and repeating with the bitter feelings the name of the unfortunate marshal. During the day, we shared the right of walking in the small yard, without being, however, allowed to remain there together, though he was always accompanied by a gendarme. I was in the habit of making my walk at 6 o'clock in the morning. The marshal wished to take that hour for his walk. I resigned it to him with great pleasure, and this arrangement lasted until his solitary confinement ended. From that time, his lady and children came every day to dine with him. She always accompanied him in his walks. One day she came near my window and said to me, "The sentry that guards us is an old soldier who has served under the marshal. He wishes very much to talk to you." The marshal, in consequence, came up. Our conversation could not be long. He said to me, "I am easy as to what concerns myself. A great many friends watch over me. The government is advancing fast again towards its ruin. The foreigners already take our part. The public indignation has communicated itself to them, and if you wish to have a proof of it, read these papers and burn them when you have done." He then slipped through the bars a file of pamphlets and some manuscript sheets. I found in them violent threats and even provocations that appeared to me very ill-advised. There was also a great deal of absurd news. According to their accounts, the English already repented having replaced the House of Bourbon upon the throne. And there was a long protest of the Empress Maria Louisa against the resolution of the sovereigns who kept her out of France. What the Marshal had told me about his friends was more correct. But sometime after, I learned that he had failed in an attempt to escape from the conciergerie, and that 6,000 officers on half pay had been forced to leave the metropolis by order of the Minister of War. A little while after that conversation, we again exchanged the hours of our walks. He then went down in the evening, accompanied by his wife, his brother-in-law, and his sister-in-law, Madame Gameau. The prisoners had retired to their dormitories. Among them was a soldier called Dieu, whose good voice and comic songs diverted the Marshal.